Hey everyone, welcome to another Explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive paradigm shift when it comes to how countries actually get rich. It's a fascinating story of transformation, and honestly, the catalyst right at the center of it all, well, it might just surprise you.
Think about it for a second. What really builds a modern economy? Usually, our minds jump straight to gleaming factories, bustling ports, or, massive tech startups. But is that the whole story? Or is there a hidden engine beneath all of that, just silently powering growth from the ground up?
See, for the longest time, classical economic theory had this really rigid view. Agriculture was basically seen as this passive support sector, something that just sat there to provide food and basic raw materials, while industry swooped in and did all the heavy lifting of economic growth. But actually, modern development economics completely turns that old view on its head. The new view? It reveals that agriculture is actually the active catalyst for economic transformation. It's literally the spark that ignites the entire engine of a developing nation. So, let's dive right into this. We've got a great roadmap today. First, the true economic engine. Then, feeding and fueling industry, funding the future, the developmental paradox, and finally, the web of linkages.
All right, part one, the true economic engine.
Instead of picturing agriculture as just a flat, static field of wheat, I want you to think of it as the deep, incredibly strong concrete base that you absolutely need to support a towering industrial skyscraper. Economists Bruce Johnston and John Mellor actually proposed a brilliant framework for this. They identified 5 major gears of this agricultural engine that mechanically interlock to drive overall development. We've got food, labor, market, savings, and foreign exchange. Now, these aren't just isolated ideas. They turn together seamlessly to push a whole economy forward. Let's see how they actually work in practice.
Moving on to part two, feeding and fueling industry.
Let's look at the most fundamental need of literally any developing society, feeding a rapidly growing urban workforce. If that food supply fails, well, a massive domino effect kicks in. First, poor harvests lead to a drop in market supply, right? That immediately makes food prices spike. Now, because food is obviously a basic necessity, those urban factory workers suddenly face a much higher cost of living. So, what happens? They demand higher wages just to survive. And finally, when factories have to pay their workers more simply so they don't starve, it drives up industrial production costs across the board. It's this vicious domino effect known as the wage price spiral. Basically, a lack of agricultural productivity will completely stall out the manufacturing sector.
And that actually brings us to a super fascinating concept called disguised unemployment. This happens when rural households employ way more workers than they actually need, which results in surplus labor with zero or near zero marginal productivity. Imagine a family farming business with 10 people doing the exact same work that 6 could easily handle. If those extra 4 people pack up their bags and move to the city, the farm's total food output doesn't drop a single bit.
But how do we systematically get those extra 4 people to where they are actually most needed? The answer is technological progress. Technological progress releases labor. When you bring in modern tractors, better seeds, and scientific farming techniques, you drastically increase the productivity per worker. So you need far fewer workers to farm that exact same plot of land. That surplus labor is then released to migrate to cities and become highly productive factory workers. This kind of massive structural shift is exactly what historically supercharged rapid industrialization in places like Japan, South Korea, China, and Taiwan.
And here's where it gets even better. When farms get more productive, rural incomes naturally rise. That triggers an absolutely massive multiplier effect. Millions of rural consumers suddenly have disposable income to go out and buy clothes, mobile phones, and packaged food. At the same time, the commercial farms themselves are buying large-scale tractors and fertilizers. So, rising rural incomes create this huge domestic market. It kicks off a beautiful cycle where rural spending directly drives industrial jobs, which then generates even more income. It is just an incredible feedback loop.
All right, that brings us to part 3, funding the future.
So, we've talked about food, labor, and markets. But how on earth does a developing nation actually pay for massive infrastructure projects? Power plants, schools, modern railways? Well, it all comes down to mobilizing capital. In the early stages of a country's development, agriculture is usually the largest sector of the economy by far. So it provides the crucial domestic savings and tax revenue needed to finance national development. As farmers earn more money, they deposit their rising incomes into banks as voluntary savings. And then those banks turn around and lend that money to new industrial businesses. On the public side, governments mobilize resources through things like land taxes and export duties. In fact, this exact tactic of using agricultural surplus to build national infrastructure was famously used to great effect by many East Asian economies.
And we can't forget the foreign exchange gear. Building an industrial base means you have to import heavy machinery, precision tools, and advanced tech. And you generally have to buy those things using foreign currencies, like US dollars or euros. So how do developing nations get their hands on those currencies? By exporting agricultural products, things like rice, coffee, and spices. These agricultural exports earn the foreign exchange that is absolutely necessary to import advanced tech, which prevents those crippling balance of payments crises. So in a very real way, agriculture literally pays for the tools of tomorrow.
Now, what's really interesting is this next part, Part 4, the developmental paradox.
Okay, here is the great plot twist of this whole explainer. If agriculture is so fundamentally vital to an economy, why does its share of the GDP shrink as countries become wealthier? It's a great question, right? To understand this, we need to look at Ernst Engel's law. Let's break down a hypothetical monthly paycheck. Say you make 20,000 rupees. You might spend 10,000 of that on food. That's a whopping 50% of your income. But as your income goes up to 50,000 and then, say, 100,000 rupees, the absolute amount you spend on food definitely rises. Maybe you start buying better quality food, up to 20,000 rupees. But look at the percentage share. It plummets all the way down to just 20%.
Notice what happens there. When the share of income spent on food drops from 50% down to 20%, all that freed up income doesn't just vanish into thin air. Consumers start funneling their growing wealth into totally different sectors. They start paying for better education, advanced healthcare, tourism, and of course, consumer electronics.
And that, right there, resolves our paradox. Agriculture's share of the total GDP shrinks because industry and services expand at a lightning-fast pace, not because farming itself is declining. Actually, advanced economies still have incredibly productive, massive farming systems. It's just that the tech, service, and manufacturing sectors have grown so ridiculously fast, they just completely outpace agriculture in relative size.
Which leads us to our final section, Part 5, the web of linkages.
Let's reveal the invisible tentacles that connect the farm to everyday modern life. First up, we have backward linkages. Modern agriculture is a super high-tech endeavor these days. To maintain those massive high yields, farms demand immense amounts of fertilizers, tractors, diesel, electricity, and increasingly digital advisory services. By constantly demanding all these advanced inputs, modern farming basically acts as a permanent stimulus package for the manufacturing and tech industries.
And then, on the flip side, we have forward linkages. Agriculture isn't just about what is on your dinner plate, it is quite literally the clothes on your back and the tires on your car. Think about it. A cotton farm supplies the textile industry. Sugarcane drives the massive ethanol industry. Rubber feeds tire manufacturing, and timber supports the entire furniture and paper industry. It is all deeply connected.
So, let's tie this all together. Agriculture really is the concrete base of the modern industrial skyscraper. The core takeaway of this explainer is that sustainable agricultural development underpins resilient economic growth, even as its share of the GDP shrinks over time. Its foundational role in providing food, labor, capital, and raw materials is the hidden engine that makes modern life possible.
Which brings us to a final, pretty provocative question. If agriculture built the modern world, what happens to our future if we neglect it today? As we all constantly obsess over the newest software and artificial intelligence, maybe we need to make sure we're still tending to the roots that sustain us all. I hope this explainer empowered you with a totally new lens through which to view global economics. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep exploring.